Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Children's Cardiomyopathy Foundation's webinar, Overview of Clinical Trials. My name is Gina Petty, and I am the Executive Director of the Children's Cardiomyopathy Foundation. The Children's Cardiomyopathy Foundation, or CCF, is a nonprofit organization dedicated to finding the causes and cures for pediatric cardiomyopathy through the support of research, education, awareness, and advocacy. Established in 2002, CCF has grown into a global community of families, physicians, and scientists focused on improving the diagnosis, treatment, and quality of life for children with cardiomyopathy. We are grateful to our corporate partners for their support and extend our thanks today to Bristol Myers Squibb for sponsoring today's webinar. All content has been developed independent of BMS. During today's webinar, questions are encouraged and welcome. Questions can be submitted via your question box located on your control panel. We will reserve the last portion of the session for questions. You're welcome to submit your questions throughout the presentation as you think of them, and then we will go through them at the conclusion of the talk. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our CCF website and YouTube page in the coming days. We are so thrilled today to be joined by Dr. Jennifer Su. Dr. Su is the Director of Heart Failure and Cardiomyopathies at Children's Hospital, Los Angeles. She is also the co-director of the Center for Cardiogenomics. Dr. Su received her Doctor of Medicine from University of California, Irvine. She completed her residency in pediatrics at UCLA and a fellowship in pediatric cardiology with subspecialty in heart failure and transplantation at Children's Hospital, Los Angeles. Dr. Su's research interests include heart failure, mechanical circulatory support, heart transplantation, and cardiogenomics. When not at work, Dr. Su enjoys baking with her kids, gardening, and working at her nonprofit organization, Aaron's Foundation, to promote education and research on sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. Dr. Su, thank you so much for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you. Welcome.
Thanks, Gina. Thanks, Liz. And thank you to the Children's Cardiomyopathy Foundation for giving me this opportunity. I really enjoy spending time with families and parents and making sure all this medical jargon becomes something that's more understandable and helpful to families that we serve. So I will go ahead and share my screen. All right. Can you guys give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen?
Yes, that's good. Thank you.
Okay, so let's get started here. Today I'm going to be talking about clinical trials in pediatric cardiomyopathy, and thank you for that very generous introduction. The topics that I'm going to go over with clinical trials are, we're going to talk about what is a clinical trial, why are they important, what are the different phases of a clinical trial, what participation might look like, and what happens after a trial is complete. And then we'll go into some common questions regarding clinical trials. And of course, I hope that you guys will have some questions that we can have discussion about as well. So first off, to define a clinical trial, clinical trials look at new ways to prevent, detect, or treat disease. The treatment might be new drugs, medications, or a combination, or even surgical procedures, devices, or new ways of using existing treatments. And the goal of a clinical trial is to determine whether a new test or treatment works and is safe. And oftentimes we compare this new test or a treatment with what currently is being used. So there's kind of a timeline here of how clinical studies work. There generally starts with an idea in the laboratory under preclinical studies. This can be using animal models or just basic lab research. And then when we are pretty certain that there is great promise to a medication or a treatment, we'll go into a clinical trial where we will have patients often participate and help us to determine whether we can extrapolate this information to humans. And then if everything goes well and we do find the same amount of promise and benefit to our patients, then the FDA will approve the treatment. And I wanted to take a moment to go through all the different clinical research designs, a clinical research being research in medicine, because there are many, and it's worthwhile talking about so that you get an understanding of where clinical trials lie within this whole mess of research. So to break down clinical research into two arms, there are first observational studies in which we just observe what's going on. And then there's treatment studies where we will administer a treatment or a procedure and see how different groups might react, groups that have treatment and groups that don't. Because we're not going to be talking that much about observational studies, I'll just kind of go through very quickly what different types of observational studies are. So going in the bottom right corner here, case reports and case studies are kind of like the most primitive form of research, but also can be exciting. What they are is they're detailed descriptions of one or more patients by documented new and unusual cases. Generally, research will start with a hypothesis based on these patients. So there are really notable cases that might we think we can adapt to the larger population. And this is descriptive. We just kind of report what we saw, our experience, and get it out in the community to see if other doctors or other researchers might see similar things. And that's how we start cross-talking. Moving up to the analytical observational studies, there are a few, and you may have heard some of these words before. To make sure everyone's on the same page, there's cross-sectional studies in which it's like a cross-section in time. So a snapshot of many patients at one moment in time. The benefit of a cross-sectional study is that it can show how a common condition can present and help identify factors associated with it. In comparison, a case control study is not just one snapshot in time. We follow patients throughout, months or years. It's called a case control because we are comparing a group of people or cases who have a condition versus a control group of people who don't have the condition. And we follow both of the groups over time to see how they're different in terms of how they start, what they experience, and we can use this often to identify risk factors that emerge for a medical condition. And finally, in the observational studies, cohort studies, a cohort is just a large group of people that's observed over time. And some of these will eventually develop a disease or condition. And so researchers can often learn how the condition occurs and how to find possible causes or risk factors. And these trials are just simply a difference in design. They can be applied to any condition, any medical problem. It's just how the researcher decides to approach the question that they're trying to answer with the research. So now that we've talked about observational studies, which we won't really go into further detail about, we're going to talk about treatment studies. And so when we talk about clinical trials, most of the time we're actually referring to these treatment studies. And there's three major ones, with the top one, randomized controlled trials, being the gold standard, the typically, what we talk about with the most when we're talking about, oh, this research study has shown, this medication effectiveness with such great research. That's probably a randomized controlled trial. And what it is participants are randomly assigned to two or more different test groups to test the effectiveness of treatment. So randomized controlled trials analyze the response of a treatment group versus a control group that has a what we call a placebo, which is a treatment that's not really a treatment. No one, not the study participants, not the researchers know who's getting what, which who gets a placebo and who actually gets a treatment. But we follow these patients or these participants over time. And ideally, we can see that there's a difference in outcome. Hopefully, the treatment is better. The people who receive the actual treatment is better. And at the end of the study, we'll do what we call an unblinding, where everyone or the researchers at least find out who got what, and then they can analyze whether or not the treatment is effective or not. And so the reason why this is considered gold standard is because the researchers are blinded, and so they're not biased in any way, thinking that, oh, okay, this patient got a treatment, so they're probably doing well, and maybe they might follow them closer, treat them more, or do something subconsciously even to be different, and that may also affect whether or not a patient may be doing well or not as well. So those are randomized controlled trials. And in comparison, non-randomized controlled trials do have a large role in research because there are certain times where it's just frankly not possible or sometimes unethical to randomize a patient to things, for example, surgical interventions where you can't really tell the surgeon, like, okay, just, do this surgery. Like the surgeon will know what surgery they're doing. They're not going to be randomized to doing one surgery versus another surgery. They kind of already know which surgery they're going to do, and it's probably not a good idea to, just assign something either. Or if there's a medication that we already know is very good, to not give that as part of the trial might not be considered ethical, or if we find out that something has a large side effect, and to be continuing to give that. Um, Finally, adaptive trials are becoming a little bit more popular in recent years. What they are is they're trials in which we evaluate a drug, but also make modifications during the trial itself to perhaps increase the dose or increase the duration of the treatment based on what the participant how the participant responds. And so this adaptation of the study goes throughout the trial, and it's already pre-specified by the study protocol. The main advantage to having an adaptive trial is that it allows for faster results, as researchers can respond to the data in real time and not wait till the end of the study to make any sort of adjustment. And this typically is focusing on patient population or dosages for observation of effectiveness. So why are clinical trials important? A well-designed clinical trial is the gold standard for proving that a treatment is or a medical approach works. Clinical trials, as I said, can't always be used. Another good example here is that a scientist can't just randomize people to living in different places to observe whether them living in different places might affect, their health or other outcome, or can't actually just start to tell people to smoke or eat an unhealthy diet to study obesity or to study lung disease. So some these situations, the habitual ones, are much better studied through a cross-sectional or a case control, one of those observational studies in which the patients or the participants are already doing what they're doing. And so we're just observing, how that might affect their life and their health. On the bottom here is another way of looking at the different research studies. And on the top, as I said, the case series or the case reports, those are typically the least effective, like the starting point. studies. And then as you get further and further down, you kind of go cross the barrier of observational into a treatment. And then the clinical trial is the treatment trial, with randomized controlled trials within that group of research studies being the gold standard. So there are different phases of the clinical trial, and so it can get kind of confusing when maybe one of your friends is talking about something with only five, participants, and another one is talking about a clinical trial with thousands, and how can they differ so widely? So as we mentioned before, we research studies typically start out with preclinical studies, so laboratory studies, and these typically take several years to develop a medication or a treatment that we think is promising enough and doesn't have side effects that we want to move forward with testing it on patients. And so the preclinical studies really are focused on providing information on what is a safe dose, an effective dose, and then also what's toxic, because certainly we wouldn't want to subject any research participant to those sorts of risks. So after a preclinical study is complete and the company comes up with a medication that they really think is promising and wants to test on patients, we go into phase one of clinical trials. Phase one is a very small group of patients. It's typically less than 100 patients. And it's usually the testing period is for several months, and it's very few because we're still evaluating the safety of a medication. We don't want to, these patients probably are the ones who are sicker and are pushed more into wanting to um, uh, wanting to try more experimental treatment because there's just nothing really great out there for their condition. And so these patients help with gathering information about how the medication or the drug interacts with the human body. And once phase one is over, we've determined that it's safe enough to be giving a larger population, and we have more information about how this medication can affect humans with in terms of their side effects and their dosing. We will then go to phase two, so we're not completely blind to what safety and dosing might look like in humans. So phase two is bigger. As opposed to phase one, where they're usually less than 100 patients, phase two is typically about 1 to 300 patients who will get enrolled. And the focus is to not just continue to assess the safety, but also now the dosing of the medication. So all throughout the phases of the clinical trial, we're always looking at the safety, but now we're also looking at side effects, choosing which dose might be working best to have a balance of something that's effective, yet not causing too many side effects. And also, of course, checking for effectiveness. Once a drug passes phase two and we still think that the medication is promising, we'll go into phase three, which probably most of you have encountered at some point, because this phase is where the medication is not yet FDA approved, but it's the goal is to enroll as many people as possible. Typically in adult studies where, there are a lot of adults who want to do research, it can be over 1,000 patients. These are the ones that are generally in our public journal publications. That's like big news that we hear about in our conferences before FDA approval, because these are the ones that kind of typically generate a lot more publicity because we already know that it's promising, and now we want to know how effective it is. So we're still continuing to monitor safety, of course, but now we want to see, is this medicine more effective than what's currently out there or not? Is it worth trying to put more resources into making this medication, because is it just the same, or can we prove that it's better than what's out there? And of course, we're also monitoring the safety. So if a drug is good enough and promising enough that it is not only safe and it has fewer side effects, or at least the same amount of side effects as what's currently out there, and it's more effective, then the researchers will apply for FDA approval for this medication. It's a very rigorous process. So the FDA will look with a fine-tooth comb over all the research studies that are out there regarding a particular medication. And it takes, months to maybe several years. And then the FDA will, in the end, if everything looks very promising and safe, will approve the medication. And oftentimes, even after FDA approval, a drug is still kind of like, we still keep an eye on it. It's called post-marketing safety and efficacy. So it's already marketed to the general population. So now it's available to thousands and thousands of people, but we're still gathering information on the drug's effectiveness on various populations. Perhaps it affects like certain conditions more, certain genetic predispositions, or certain ethnicities. So we want to know, a lot more about the profile of the drug and how it can be used, and perhaps certain population subsets that might experience particular side effects. So what happens during a clinical trial? A clinical trial process kind of depends on what kind of trial is being conducted. But in general, every research team is going to include physicians or researchers, sometimes both, nurses, social workers, and other healthcare professionals to support the participants and to support the patients. And this team of researchers will check in on the health of a participant at the beginning of the trial and give specific instructions for participating in the trial. They'll monitor carefully the patients during the trial, and then, of course, stay in touch after the trial is completed. Some clinical trials will involve more testing and visits to a physician than a participant normally would have for their illness or condition. So that's another point to remember if you want to participate in a study, that it might not always be just what standard of care. So who can participate in a clinical trial? All clinical trials have guidelines about who can participate, and this is typically called inclusion and exclusion criteria. The inclusion criteria, it refers to factors that allow someone to participate in a clinical trial. Common inclusion criteria are age. So, for example, a study might just be looking at adolescents, or a medical condition like cardiac hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, or sometimes it can be looking at patients who are already on a particular medicine because they want to compare with a patient on that medicine with a newer medication that's out there. Conversely, exclusion criteria are criteria that will exclude someone from participating. Oftentimes, if someone's already enrolled in another clinical trial, that might be an exclusion criteria. They don't want you to be committed to two at a time, and or they may be worried that the trials might cross paths for some reason in a way that would affect the results. Other exclusion, age again is another common exclusion criteria. Typically these days, language barriers are no longer exclusion criteria. because there's translators, and I think most researchers want to adapt their research study to as large of a population as possible to get as much information about their medication as possible. These criteria, again, are based typically on age, gender, type and stage of disease, previous treatment history, and other medical conditions. And some research seeks participants with illness or conditions that to be studied in a clinical trial, while others might actually need healthy volunteers. Sometimes these are called the control group. So what should people consider before participating in a clinical trial? Because every clinical trial is different, you need to consider them, individually. But there are important factors to consider before participating, and almost always these many of these answers for factors to consider will be found in what's called an informed consent form that you'll be provided with, which will give a detailed outline of what the study is, who is doing the study, what it might entail, and what you should expect. On top of the informed consent informed consent form, if you have additional questions, make sure you clarify your concerns before agreeing to participate. I've listed here some really good questions to ask if they're not readily available or the researchers don't discuss it, because these are things often that affect the families that might not be on the top priority of the researchers, because they don't their focus is on the research question and the medication, and they may not remember, or it may be more of a secondary condition. I mean, a consideration of how it may impact, any particular participant in terms of, for example, cost issues. Will I have to pay for anything? Because that's really important for families, and actually for anyone who needs to pay for a test or a study. Will there be any consideration of travel or child care costs? Something that's oftentimes overlooked is how it might impact school. As physicians, we see you guys in the hospital. We don't oftentimes realize that you have a full life outside of the hospital, outside of clinic, that you may not want to disrupt. And so because there's oftentimes a different identity of like, okay, well, this person is a patient and I know them in clinic, it may be hard to kind of automatically remember, well, he's also a student, and he's also, has all these other extracurriculars that we want them to participate in, and we just might not have the time to do it. And of course, many families don't have the resources to drive, many miles to get somewhere. Who's going to pay for the gas? Is that something that families have to do, or is that something reimbursable? These are excellent questions that really should be asked beforehand, regardless of whether it will make a difference in whether you want to participate. Other questions are, what are your responsibilities if you participate? How do possible risks and benefits of the trial compare with other options? What kind of therapies or procedures will my child have to endure during the trial? Many children have already spent way too much time in the hospital or in clinics. And even though participation in a research trial is important, because we of course want more answers, we also want to make sure that it's not coming at the cost of mental and emotional, difficulty for our children. And then will we be told about trial results? A lot of times research takes many years, and it sometimes people might lose touch, or they might move out of town. So how will we be told? What's the mechanism? How can we ask? Who can we contact when we want, to know what's going on or want an update? Okay, so what are the benefits of participating in a clinical trial? A well-designed and well-executed clinical trial will provide the best approach for participants to play an active role in their healthcare, to gain access to new research treatments before they become widely available, to receive regular and careful medical attention from research teams that include doctors and other healthcare professionals, and to help others by contributing to medical research. Oftentimes, there's other incentives. There may be financial incentives. There may be other inside like information that may lead a family to decide one way or the other. But really, I think that the most important thing is just to be active in your child's health and be an active player in understanding, the newest information about your child's health. Patient safety, of course, is very important. As we talked about every phase of the clinical trial, we're assessing safety. So how do we do that? Clinical trials that test any intervention, which is treatment or surgery or procedures, are closely supervised by the Data and Safety Monitoring Board, or DSMB. And this board is made of experts who review results of the study as it progresses. They determine that the study, that the experimental treatment, if they determine the experimental treatment is not working or is harmful, they will stop the trial early. Clinical trials require prompt reporting of all adverse events during the study. And it's important to know that adverse events don't just include any events that we think may be related to the treatment or the study, but also anything bad that happens while a participant is enrolled in a study is considered an adverse event. So for example, if your child is on a medication treatment for cardiomyopathy, but throughout the study in the few months that they were there during the winter season, got RSV and was hospitalized for a viral infection that is completely separate from the medication, we would still report that as an adverse event because we are trying to capture every single bad thing that may happen to patients. And at the end of the trial, we adjudicate these adverse events to determine whether or not we think there's any pattern. Maybe, these kids will be more likely to need hospitalization for viral infections. We don't actually know that off the bat until we see all the information, and then we can come to a more informed decision about whether that medication may have affected the hospitalization or not. So after hearing about a clinical trial, you can make an informed decision about whether or not to participate. If you decide to participate, you'll be given an informed consent form to sign. Possibly the most important thing to know about an informed consent form is this bottom bold: an informed consent you sign, but it is not a contract. Do not feel like you're pigeonholed into having to commit to something that you later decide is not right for your child or your family. It is basically the signature will indicate that the researchers went through the research information with you in detail and that you understand the following points, which is your participation is voluntary. You know why the research is being done. You know what the researchers are trying to accomplish. You know what will be done and for how long, what the risks are involved, what possible benefits are expected, and what other treatments are available. Essentially, you're signing this informed consent to make sure that you at least have the basic knowledge of what the study is doing down. This is the time to ask all your other questions because this is where we want to empower families to be as educated about what's going on regarding them or their children as possible so that they can be active players in, this study. There's also the word assent, and this is not to be confused with consent, but it is similar. So, assent is the agreement of someone who's not yet able to give legal consent to participate in an activity. So, in California, where I am, consent, you have to be 18 years or above to give consent. If you're 17 years old, you still need a guardian to give consent, but you clearly understand what's going on with your body, what you're doing. And of course, we want children, just like their parents, to be as active and as informed as possible about what's going on with their bodies. So assent out of respect for children or adolescents, as developing individuals, we want them to be part of the decision of whether or not to participate in the research, particularly if they can understand what it means to volunteer for the benefit of others. And typically, assent is sought for children as young as 7 years old, because they can already understand what's going on, the medications they're taking, why they're taking it. And of course, the exact age will depend on a child's ability to understand or make that decision. So let's talk a little bit about study completion. When a clinical trial is completed, the research team analyzes information to make decisions about findings and any need for future testing. After phase 1 or phase 2 trial, they will decide whether to continue testing the treatment or to stop because the medication is just not promising enough. If a study is already in phase 3, then after that trial is over, the researchers will then examine whether the treatment is more effective and has fewer side effects than the current standard treatment. And if it is, they'll submit a new drug application to the FDA so that it can become the new medication. Once your clinical trial is over, you can follow its progress online. I'll show you where, or follow up with your care team to find out about the results. So to follow the progress online, you can search the trial on clinicaltrials.gov. If you can't remember that for the moment, just Google clinical trials, and clinicaltrials.gov is the first link, and you can find updates there. Before the trial is over, clinical trials typically will conduct what's called an exit interview with participants. And this is a good time to ask researchers about how to stay connected after you complete your trial. So in the exit interview, the participants, this is a common way for researchers to listen to feedback from participants at the end of the trial. And while these interviews mostly focus on how you felt during the study or how your child felt during the study, they are used also to discuss trial results with participants. And so if the results aren't back yet, this is a good time to ask questions about what the findings so far are and how to stay connected at the completion. You may wonder, so if you're in a randomized controlled trial and it comes out that you're actually on treatment and your child is doing well, many families will be interested in perhaps continuing the treatment after the trial ends, before FDA approval. So the researchers will inform you about treatment options after the trial ends, often as part of the informed consent. So they typically will talk about this at the beginning when they're going through the trial construct with you. Common options for accessing treatment is that 1, the manufacturer of the treatment will make it available to volunteers after the study, all volunteers after the study's ended, and that's called an open label extension, or OLE. An OLE allows more data to be collected and allows the opportunity for participants previously on placebo to take the active drug. Participants may be able to purchase the medication privately after the drug study ends. This is particularly relevant if the trial isn't necessarily for a new medication, but a new application of a medicine that was used for something else previously. So it's already on the market, but just not marketed for that particular condition. And then in situations where it will take some time before treatment is accessible, participants may be given the best treatment that's already available through the FDA for their condition first. And that's just standard of care. So that means that sometimes the trial medication is just not available. So I'm going to go through some other frequently asked questions. There's like 3 or 4 of them that I wanted to touch base on that didn't fit really in my talk. And then after that, I wanted to open it up for discussion. So how do I find out about a clinical trial? As I mentioned briefly earlier, go to clinicaltrials.gov. That's the website. And depending on what you're looking for, you can kind of explore the website. But if you're looking for things, trials that are active, this is the front page. You want to click, it defaults to all studies. You want to click recruiting and not yet recruiting studies. These are things that are actively recruiting right now. And then you press search. And so I did this yesterday, I think, or a few days ago. I typed in pediatric and cardiomyopathy mainly because I figured that many of you in the audience would be interested in that. And of course, just the active ones. And there's only 6 that are available now in clinicaltrials.org. These are the 6. So what I did to navigate was, so there's 6 here in search results. There's a card view where you get a huge, like a lot of detail on every single one. But if you do table view, you can kind of see all of them with a bird's eye view, and then you can kind of click on whatever you're interested in. So here's the status. This is the title, of course. The status, there's 2 that are recruiting. 4 that are recruiting, 2 that are not yet recruiting. And then you can look at the condition. For example, if your child has specifically, Miss C, then the only one that's relevant right now for Miss C is this one, the pediatric inflammatory multisystem syndrome. Or if your child has Danon disease, then here's one over here. And then interventions are important. Interestingly, so we're talking about clinical trials being mostly a treatment. There are 3 right now that are observational, which means that there's no intervention, 1, 2, and 3. Basically, they are just recruiting patients with a specific condition to observe them over time. It may still include getting extra lab draws and things like that, but there's not actually a medication or a device or a procedure that's involved with the study to test whether it's better than standard. So I'll let you guys kind of go online and look on your own, but I wanted to get you started there in case you weren't sure how to start. So next question, what kind of preparation should a potential participant make for meeting with a research coordinator or a doctor? So first, consider taking a family member or friend along for support and for asking questions or recording answers. You can plan ahead what to ask, but don't hesitate to ask any new questions when you think of while you're there. Write down the questions in advance and make sure that you remember to ask all of them. Write down the answers so that you can review them whenever you want. Oftentimes you can also ask them for a contact information so you can call them back if you have, if you're like me, you'll walk to the car and halfway to the car, you're like, oh, my most important question, I forgot. And then ask about bringing a tape recorder to make taped records of what's said, or even if you write down the answers. And sometimes it can be helpful if you, you can't jot too much detail down at one time. So does a participant continue to work with a primary healthcare provider while in a trial? Yes, most clinical trials will provide short-term treatment related to designated illness or condition, but do not provide an extended or complete primary healthcare team. In addition, you will, by having a healthcare provider work with the research team, the participant can ensure that other medications and treatments will not conflict with the protocol. So there is a medical team that's part of the research team, but it's really the scope of that team is to make sure that you're getting the medications for the research study. You may be getting blood pressure and, vital signs and lab work done. So that's why they need a medical team. But typically for a lot of our children with heart conditions, they have other, medical details that need to be taken care of. And it's not a good idea to pause, general medical care just for research. It's really not the research team is not comprehensive enough to provide what I think is, you know, total medical care for our children. Who sponsors clinical trials? So this is very variable. They're typically sponsored or funded by various organizations or individuals, including physicians, foundations, medical institutions, voluntary groups, pharmaceutical companies, as well as federal agencies such as the NIH or National Institute of Health and the Department of Veteran Affairs or the Department of Defense, the DoD. There's a ton of different ways that a clinical trial can be sponsored, and all of that information should be included in that website when you look at clinicaltrials.gov. Here are some really good resources for patients and families about clinical trials that if you're interested and you want to hear more, there's of course the website. The clinical trials website also has a page specifically for patients and families, especially including a lot of logistics and questions that may come up from a participant side. YouTube, I think this is from the NIH, but NIH posted a 9-minute message for parents and caregivers about clinical trials. The NIH has a lot of clinical trials ongoing that is not just cardiac. So they talk a lot about clinical trials on their website. And then there's a clinical trial Facebook group, Children's and Clinical Studies, if you're interested and you have social media. I'm going to pause here to see if there's any additional questions that have come up. I know I took actually longer than I thought, so I hope I gave enough time for questions. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing talk full of wonderful information. So we will open up the question session now. So feel welcome to type in any additional questions that you might have had come up in your question panel. But just to get us started, as an initial question, can you talk a bit about if there is a qualification process beyond the inclusion-exclusion criteria before participating in a study? Like, are there blood tests? Are there other types of procedures or physical requirements that a child goes through to qualify and enroll ultimately in a trial?
That's a really great question. I would say that most qualifications are through the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Oftentimes it will For example, if it's a blood test, it may be like the child can't be anemic or something like that. Or developmental status is also very important. Sometimes, especially for children who need to do something, take a medication, undergo a procedure that may not necessarily be straightforward. The inclusion and exclusion criteria may specify that the child has to be able to do this without anesthesia. And even apart from inclusion and exclusion criteria, I think just as a parent, um, it's my personal opinion that if your child says that they are not interested, they don't want to do it, even if they're not at the age to give consent, I think it's probably just not a good idea to have the child go through something or to pressure them to do something that they don't want to do. Firstly, from a logistical standpoint, it's harder to get participation, as you guys probably know, when your child doesn't buy in. And secondly, they already are living with a condition that makes them a little different from other children. And so if that's something that they're not interested in doing, I think that they should have the agency to decide as well.
Thank you. A follow-up question on Ascent. You mentioned that Ascent can be used for patients as young as 7. Are there different forms for different age groups used? Do the younger children versus teenagers have a different process or different forms?
That's a really great question because some research studies do. They have typically a younger age, like 7 to 13, and then an older adolescent, 13 to 17, and others that maybe are like smaller studies or simpler, like more straightforward studies won't. And it's mainly it's mainly an informed consent that has been simplified. The language has been simplified even more, so that children as young as 7 can understand it. So it may be oversimplified for like teenagers, but it's really the point of an assent is to make sure that no matter how old you are, as long as you understand what research is, you kind of get the gist of it. And oftentimes researchers will rely on the parents to have the more thorough discussion about the mechanics of the research study with their child.
Thank you. Another question is, if a family does not live nearby a study site, are there any opportunities for some of the monitoring visits to be coordinated with a local provider in consultation with the study site, or do they always have to go to the study sites for those visits?
As far as I know, and this is, you may actually encounter a situation where you can have a local site, but in the research studies that I've seen, especially the larger ones, they typically will want you to go to a study site. Sometimes I can envision that some study sites may partner with local sites, but because the research is typically so highly scrutinized and so protocolized, it may be logistically incredibly difficult for someone to be able to partner with a local site. I would say that that's the minority.
Great, thank you. Certainly we know that the studies are variable within themselves, but do you have a sense of the length of, a typical study and the number of visits that families might expect if they participate in a treatment-based trial?
So the length of the study typically will depend on the phase of the trial. Phase 1 and 2 of clinical trials typically take a few months. Recruitment may be over years, but we're not recruiting everyone all at once. So the recruitment may be over a few years, but participation for any specific person is probably only for a few months. In terms of the phase 3 trials, those will be for a few years. And depending on what kind of treatment or how much monitoring may or may not be needed, that will determine the cadence or the number of visits. Typically, a normal cadence would be monthly.
Great, thank you. And going back to the adverse effects, can you elaborate on what types of measures or benchmarks are in place for parents to be updated on safety measures and their child's progress in participation?
So the researchers should be telling you directly for any adverse event that, any adverse. Sorry about that. So the researchers should be telling you if there's any adverse effect that we know is related to the study. That's actually something that's typically instituted by the DSMB. If we're not sure, then they may wait till the end of the study to make sure. And it's very important for patients, any particular patient, to tell the researchers of any side effect that they may perceive, anything that's off about their child during the study, because that should be reported, even if it's a minor adverse event. So part of the information gathering is actually through you proactively letting the researchers know that, this is going on with my child.
Great, thank you. A clarifying question, if there is a double-blind study, at what point are you informed of which group your child was in? Is it after the study ends, or is it at the exit interview?
It's typically after the study ends.
Okay.
Oh, I think you're on mute.
I apologize. Thank you. Um, One more question. Given how rare cardiomyopathy is, when recruiting for clinical trials, again, we understand that this might be variable, but how many participants are being recruited at different phases of trials generally?
So that depends on the trial itself. I was giving numbers like hundreds and then thousands, and I have to admit that those are typically for adult trials. In pediatrics, and this is very, very common, we have such a special population. It is a small group of kids. And so usually researchers feel incredibly lucky even to get to 100 patients. I would say that for the most part, we're not limiting patients with the numbers that we want to recruit. We want to recruit as many as possible. But I think just from a practical standpoint, because we know our population is so small, usually the phase 3 trials will be just several hundred.
Great, thank you so much. Well, that is the end of our questions. Thank you all for participating today. I wanted to thank you again, Dr. Sue, for joining us and lending us your time and expertise. This was an amazing session, and we're really grateful. Oh, go ahead.
Thank you for inviting me. I hope that I answered your questions. Please feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions that come up. And you are welcome to share my slides so that, the families have that as a resource if they want it.
Great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And thank you all for your attendance today. This will be up on our website in the coming days, and we'll also be sending out a follow-up email. In the meantime, please do stay in touch. You're welcome to reach out to us via email or connect with us on social media. Thank you also for all who completed our annual membership survey. We are going through those results right now, and that is what we really use to inform our webinar topic planning for the next year. So stay tuned for our calendar of 2024 events, and we thank you all. Wishing you all a happy holiday season as well. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.